Hello, everybody. My name is Kurt. I'm the new media video editor for Euploidy. Welcome to another Journal Club Global. Journal Club Global is entitled, How Can Oocyte Stimulation Affect Euploidy Rate? We're very excited to discuss a recent paper published in Sterility entitled Euploidy Rates Between Genetically Releasing Hormone Agonists and Human Chorionic Anatomy. The paper was of UConn with the authors of Jeffrey Thorne, who's now in Philadelphia, Alexandra Loza, Lee Kay, who now works at the center in Las Vegas, John Claudio Bettviva, Daniel Crow, and Lawrence Evelyn. I have a distinguished panel of discussants, and I'm a wonderful fellow program to discuss the article with us, and Reproductive Endocrinology and Fertility Fellowship at Columbia. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague at Columbia, and let them introduce themselves, who's been sent over, and hope we can have a live discussion. Thank you all in advance, and I look forward to a live discussion. So Eric, please take over.
Hi, Kurt. I'm Eric Foreman here at Columbia University in New York City. I'm joined by our three REI fellows, Zev Williams, our division director, and Bob Prosser is a senior embryologist here. And we're excited to discuss this topic, which is both clinically relevant on many levels. So I'm going to hand over to our first year fellow, Alex Robles, who's going to discuss some of the background behind the study.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us. So just to start off with the background of this paper, we know that successful completion of meiosis is necessary to produce a chromosomally competent embryo, and errors in this meiotic process can lead to addition or subtraction of chromosomes, leading to aneuploidy. Aneuploidy is the leading cause of failed implantation and miscarriage. And it is well known that errors in meiosis is inversely proportional, successful meiosis is inversely proportional to maternal age. So it is of great interest to know if there's any other factors that can impact euploidy rates. Recent reports have demonstrated that different rates of euploidy between similarly matched donor oocyte patients have been reported across different sensors, leading us to believe that potentially IVF stimulation protocols or embryo culture could have something to do with euploidy rates. It is also important to know that there has been an increasing use of GnRH agonists as trigger for final oocyte maturation. And this is because it has the great advantage of being a good way to prevent ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome in patients who are high responders. It is also important to know that GnRH agonists are more physiologic in nature. They stimulate the pituitary to secrete endogenous luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone to restart the meiosis process for final oocyte maturation. So, given that final oocyte maturation is dependent on a trigger medication, the question of concern is, does the choice of trigger actually affect the euploidy status?
Great. So I'm Jenna, I'm a second year fellow. This study that we're going to talk about is a retrospective cohort evaluating over 500 IVF cycles in over 300 patients at one large university-based center. Patients were eligible if they underwent an IVF cycle with planned PGTA. They had to be triggered for final oocyte maturation with either HCG or a GnRH agonist, and they had to have blastocyst embryos available for biopsy. Patients had different IVF stimulation protocols. They were monitored with ultrasounds and blood work. Trigger for the final oocyte maturation was performed when free follicles reached at least 17 to 18 millimeters with either HCG or GnRH agonist. The type of trigger was determined by physician preference. This preference was based on baseline parameters, follicle count, E2 level, and type of protocol. The egg retrieval was performed 35 hours after the trigger injection, and fertilization was performed by ICSI or conventional INSEM. Trabecular biopsy was performed on good quality blastocysts for planned PGA testing. PGTA testing was performed either at comparative genomic hybridization or next-generation sequencing, and results were reported as euploid, aneuploid, or mosaic. Now, the primary outcome for the study was the rate of euploid embryos per blastocyst biopsy. Data recorded as both euploidy per embryo biopsy and per oocyte retrieved, and the data was stratified by age. A secondary analysis was performed to evaluate data in only the GnRH antagonist cycles, as well as the cycles using NGS as the method of PGA testing. For the statistical analysis, continuous data was described as a mean and assessed with student t-test or Lin-Whitney U-test. Categorical data was described as a count and percentage, and chi-square testing was used. The euploid rates after GnRH agonist or an HCG trigger were evaluated using a multiple linear regression and controlled for covariance, including age, BMI, AMH, total gonadotropin dose, protocol type, utilization of mixed protocol, peak ET levels, number of oocytes retrieved, and number of embryos biopsied. To account for the multiple cycles from the same patient, a mixed effects regression model was performed. The model used fixed effects for repeated measures such as trigger type and used a random intercept for random effects covariance matrix.
Hi, I'm Salma Amran. I'm a third-year fellow at Columbia. So I'll be presenting the results. So a total of 539 IVF cycles involving 366 patients were included. In terms of the breakdown of the protocols, the majority were antagonist protocols. 376 antagonist protocols were included, 487 Lupron protocols, and 116 microdose flare protocols. And this led to 2,335 biopsy blastocysts. Now I'll draw your attention to table 1. With the characteristics here, as expected, the GnRH agonist group had lower rates, lower age, lower BMI, lower total gonadotropin use, and that same GnRH agonist group had higher AMH, number of oocytes retrieved, peak E2 level, and number of embryos retrieved. There were similar rates across trigger types for blastocysts, blastocyst rate per fertilized oocyte, and then there were similar rates of PGTM and NGS between both groups. So moving on to table 2. This table looks at euploidy rates by PGT technique and age. So on group comparison of all comers, a higher euploidy rate was observed in the GnRH agonist group of 37 versus 30%. However, when analyzing by number of euploid embryo per oocyte retrieved instead of per embryo biopsy, this was no longer statistically significant. There was also a multiple regression model performed to account for multiple cycles by the same patient. And ultimately in that regression model, the trigger type was not found to be influential on aneuploidy. Also, there were no differences between live birth rate and clinical pregnancy rate after FET with either trigger type. Euploidy rate was also then stratified by age. There was a clear drop in euploidy with increasing age in all comers. However, within the same age group, there was no difference in the blastocyst development rate or euploid embryo rates between trigger types per oocyte or per embryo biopsy. The highest rates were in women less than 35, as expected, and the lowest blastocyst development rates were in women greater than 41. This was true both in crude analysis and in multiple regression. So to the right of table 2 are the results for a sub-analysis for NGS cycles only. This group chose to do a sub-analysis of the NGS cycles because it represents the most sensitive PGT technology we have available, and is also the most widely used technology today. There was no difference in euploidy rates across trigger types for all age groups when looking at per oocyte retrieved. The NGS subgroup findings are also depicted in figure 1. So on the left of this table are the 2 columns showing percent euploidy per number of embryo biopsied with a similar level in both the GnRH agonist and HCG groups of about 37%. And then on the right of this figure, the 2 columns show euploidy rate per oocyte retrieved, again, the same across both groups. Now for yet again, this group found no difference in euploidy rates when controlling for confounders, and then looking at euploid rates per oocyte retrieved and then stratifying by age. There was then a different analysis looking specifically at GnRH antagonist cycles. There were 110 patients triggered with HCG and 185 with GnRH agonists in these antagonist cycles. And they found that there was a higher AMH, a lower H, a lower total inadequate dose, and a higher PGQ and number of oocytes retrieved in the GnRH agonist groups as you would expect. To control for confounders, multivariate linear regression was used, and no difference in euploidy rates were found between trigger types in this subgroup. Age was found to be the only significant predictor of aneuploidy.
Thank you, Selma. So we're fortunate to have some of the authors with us, and so we'd like to turn over to Dr. Thorne to tell us a little bit about what influenced this group's decision to do this study.
Thank you. Just a quick introduction. Jeff Thorne. I'm a former fellow at the University of Connecticut and now a physician at RMA at Philadelphia. I want to thank the folks at Columbia for a really nice introduction. And I also want to take this opportunity to quickly thank Dr. Barnhart and ASRM for the invitation to be here. This is an incredibly exciting opportunity. So one thing about this study that I wanted to highlight is really one of the underlying messages about patient safety. So I think we would all agree that there are risks and complications with the IVF process. And one of the biggest risks is OHSS. And I think we'd all agree that there's some really compelling literature out there that GnRH agonists used for trigger drastically reduces rates of OHSS. Yet it seems that there's still some physician unease or anxiety about using this medication during IVF. And therefore, we wanted to further explore the effectiveness of GnRH agonists for final oocyte maturation to help substantiate the data that's already out there. I think the folks at Columbia did a really nice job summarizing the paper, but we chose as our outcome euploidy rates and compared cycles triggered with both GnRH agonists and HCG. And ultimately, using a variety of different statistical methods, found that there overall was no difference in euploidy rates between the two trigger modalities. Our hope is that this really eases physician anxiety in using this medication in their practice, which ultimately is for the benefit of our patients.
I'll add to that as well. I'm Leah Kay. I'm at the Fertility Center of Las Vegas and also a co-author on this paper. I was a former fellow at UConn as well. I would piggyback off of that to say since safety is of the utmost importance, and I really hope that in reading this paper, people do feel more comfortable using the loop run trigger. And some of the discomfort may come from doing fresh transfers after loop run. And so I would hope that this could also extend to a topic of, considering freeze-all, even when PGT is not being performed for a given cycle, in order to improve the safety profile of IVF in general. I also hope that, as we talk a little bit more about this paper, we're going to talk about some of the shortcomings of any retrospective cohort study. And so my hope too is that some of the data that we've generated here will inspire a group that does a lot of PGT cycles to expand on this and perhaps design a larger prospective study to sort of help corroborate the data that we found here. I'll turn it over to the UConn group.
Thank you, Leah. I'm Claudio Bonadilla, one of the physicians here at the Center for Advanced Reproductive Services at UConn. And we have been advocates of GnRH agonist trigger for a long time in an effort to prevent OHSS and, as Jeff mentioned, to make this process safer for our patients. And one of the things I think this paper is useful is to take away some of the fears of people using GnRH agonist trigger. We wonder, is HCG needed at all in freeze-all cycles? And why are people still using HCG or even adding low-dose HCG when all the embryos are going to be frozen for PGT? And from just talking to our colleagues, I think there are two main reasons why people feel that they need to add some low dose of HCG, and knowing that that can still increase the patient's risk of OHSS. Every time you give some HCG, you are taking a risk of the patient getting hyperstimulated. So one of the reasons is the fear of trigger failure, that if you add a little bit of ACG, you're kind of having a backup in case the patient does not respond to the GnRH agonist. And the second fear is, I think what we address with this paper is, are these eggs going to perform the same? So this suboptimal egg performance, are we going to get enough mature eggs? Are they going to be euploid? So I think there is enough evidence that with GnRH agonists, you get just as many, if not more, mature eggs than you get with ACG. And we, I think, have been able to demonstrate that the percentage of euploid embryos is the same. One of my concern is when I see people using a low dose of HCG, that is not enough by itself to trigger egg maturation in combination with the agonist, is that if that's one of the small percentage, in our experience, about 1.4% of patients don't respond to the agonist trigger. If that's one of those patients that are not going to respond and you gave a little bit of ACG, now you don't have the opportunity to re-trigger the patient and go ahead with the retrieval. So once you gave low dose ACG, you are committed to do the retrieval. And then we get phone calls sometimes from colleagues all the time. What do we do now? The LH didn't go up, but we gave a little bit of ACG. So my conclusion is why use ACG at all? And stick with the agonist trigger. And of course, in patients that are candidates, the patients that are using an antagonist protocol.
Hi, my name is Allison Bartolucci. I'm the operational lab director at UConn. I would just like to echo some of the other thoughts from the other authors. But specifically in terms of the lab, patient safety is of course the utmost concern. And I would, the MDs have a lot of anxiety, but so does the lab when it comes to patients who are using a loop-run trigger, because it's new and it's different and it's unknown. So, in the lab, we tend to worry about what the outcomes of the embryos are going to be when these patients have had a different protocol. And I think this study was important because it showed us that perhaps there's no difference in the euploidy rates. And, we can be more at ease in terms of optimizing patient safety as well as the outcomes of the embryos as well.
So I'm John Nelson. I'm one of the other physicians at the Center for Advanced Reproductive Services at UConn. I think just to summarize, this study further validates, our center's very extensive experience utilizing a GnRH agonist trigger to induce final oocyte maturation, and clearly demonstrates, the efficacy of this modality. We have previously demonstrated in publications that the utilization of a GnRH trigger virtually eliminates the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And we've also previously demonstrated that in freeze-only cycles, pregnancy rates are certainly comparable when one uses a GnRH agonist trigger versus HCG. I think this raises the question as to whether or not a GnRH trigger should now be the standard of care in any cycle in which someone is going to have a freeze-only cycle, because we've demonstrated it virtually eliminates the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. I think we've also demonstrated that in fresh cycles in which a GnRH agonist trigger is utilized, if one uses a very aggressive luteal support regimen that we've previously published, one can obtain the very similar success rates as when an HCG trigger is utilized. I think this study just provides further evidence supporting the efficacy of utilizing a GnRH agonist for triggering in patients undergoing the IVF process.
One thing that I will just jump in here and touch on, which I think is a pretty valid question, is what led us to our question to explore euploidy rates. And the reason really is right now out there's some very good data that shows comparing GnRH agonist versus HCG. There's no difference in oocyte yield. There's no difference in oocyte maturity. There's equal numbers of supernumerary embryos, equivalent data on embryo quality. And I know what we ultimately really care about are clinical outcomes and pregnancy outcomes, but I think it's necessary that we really scrutinize the steps leading up to it. And given all the previous data that's been published, it seemed like the next logical step was really to explore euploidy rates, and that's what led us to this paper.
Thank you. Let's go back to Columbia. Now that you've heard some justification and rationale from the author, what other questions might you have about this paper?
Yeah, so we were wondering, there was mention that the choice of trigger was physician dependent, and we wanted to hear a little bit more about how and why trigger was used. Specifically, at what point in the cycle was this decision made? Because that might influence how one stimulates. If you know up front that you're going to be doing a Lupron trigger, you might use a higher start dose or stimulate more aggressively. Whereas if you make this decision at the end of the cycle based on the response, then I think you're more isolating this variable of just the trigger versus the combination of stimulation and trigger.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I appreciate that. Ultimately, for us, the decision is made at time of trigger. I think we all would say that we try to anticipate who may be a high or low responder. And when coming up with a treatment protocol, we try to do what is appropriate, being that trying to optimize outcomes, yet also patient safety. But what we would do is ultimately decide on trigger type, trigger modality at the time of trigger to do what we thought was safest for the patient. And I don't know if folks over at UConn want to comment further on that.
No, I agree. In general, for the majority of PGT cycles, we will plan for a possible Lupron trigger for the majority of patients. Of course, since there are different protocols that have been used in this study, patients on microdose protocols or Lupron downregulation, they are not candidates for the Lupron trigger. So I would say any patient who is on an antagonist protocol is a potential candidate. And the decision, yes, is made at the time of trigger. I would say for the most part, anybody who has any potential risk for OHSS will receive the agonist instead of ACG. So the ACG trigger is limited for the most part to the poor responder patients, patients that are on agonist protocols, or patients who had a history of a lot of immature eggs in previous cycles. Those patients will, for the most part, receive a dual trigger. So they will receive a full dose of ACG plus the agonist to try to get the combined effects of the LH surge plus the ACG.
Thanks.
Thank you. Micah, you're one of the discussants on the paper. Why don't you see if you can add a little bit of thought on what we discussed?
Kurt, I'm sorry, we couldn't hear what you said.
I was going to offer Micah Hilt as one of the commentators to comment and see what he says as well.
Is he there?
Micah, are you on mute? Let's go over to George. George, you have some comments on the paper overall? You wrote an accompanying editorial.
I think that it's a great question, and the question was studied by the authors well, and I agree there are always some drawbacks to a retrospective study. I did want to bring up particularly one drawback in that may haunt this type of study, though, given the way that the distribution of the population was. In the GnRH agonist group, it's shown that they're younger patients and thus would have higher euploidy rates, as we know, versus the HCG group. Even with correcting for age using a first order model, patients that are in the younger age groups may be overcorrected, whereas patients in the older age groups will be undercorrected. And then since they also had a different exposure, being the trigger type, that can then be mapped as an effect of the exposure. So in this case, although there was no difference found after correcting for age in this study, it may very well be even that, let's say, the GnRH agonist trigger potentially did even better in that, just based on the raw numbers there, and based on how you would expect a first order model correction to expect lower age groups to have better euploidy rates than what they actually do due to the shape of the curve. So that is one thing that can potentially be a pitfall of a study like this and such. So I was wondering what the authors, if they can comment on that.
Yeah, I think you make some excellent points on some of the limitations of a retrospective study. I mean, we're well aware that we took a retrospective approach. We're well aware that there are limitations of a retrospective approach. Mostly that you're restricted to the data that you collected, and that you're at risk of bias and confounders. And you can only do so much with statistical methodology. But honestly, I feel like using a retrospective approach was a reasonable way to initially attempt to answer this question. Absolutely agree with you that there were differences in our groups. We did the best we could to account for those differences using both regression and age stratification. Ultimately, the goal would be to perform a randomized control trial. I think we all agree that's the gold standard. But there's some limitations, feasibility and cost. So again, I feel like this was a reasonable approach to address this question. I think we did due diligence in our statistical analysis. But I think you raised some great points about some of the limitations of a retrospective study.
I can't help jump in on this given my clinical trial background, but this is a very good example of classic confounding. By definition, something that can confound your answer is something that's associated with both your studying, the exposure, and your outcome. In this case, it should be clear to everybody who's paying attention that good prognosis can be associated both with whether you give GnRH agonist or HCG. That's associated with the exposure. And clearly, it can be a good prognosis can be associated with how many aneuploid embryos you have. So this is a classic example of confounding that's appropriately identified and appropriately controlled for with logistic regression. So I wanted to congratulate you on identifying the approach and the correct analysis. If you randomize people, then those two areas should be equal, and it shouldn't be the same problem. So sorry for the teaching point, but I just wanted to point out this is a really classic example. Micah, I'd like to hear your comments as well, if you would.
Yeah, can you hear me now, Kurt?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
All right. So, yeah, I was having a conversation yesterday with someone about this paper, and they were asking, why was this done? Because anecdotally and from the published literature, we know that the percentage of mature oocytes are the same, embryo development and quality of embryos are the same, quality supernumerary embryos are the same. So it doesn't seem like there's an effect between these two trigger types and at least egg quality and embryo quality from what we can measure. But I do think this study is justified from a biologic plausibility standpoint. We know that LH and HCG have very different half-lives. They have very different affinities for the receptor. The main post-receptor mechanism for driving resumption of meiosis is upregulation and phosphorylation of CDK1. And it's been demonstrated that HCG can do that. But I couldn't find any papers that show if there's a difference in phosphorylation of CDK1 between HCG and LH. And it has been shown that HCG and LH do have varying post-receptor signaling both from a qualitative and a quantitative standpoint in the gene expression that happens. So at least there's biologic plausibility, and there's a lot of cycles using these. So I think this is an important question that should be addressed. I just want to point out that to me, I find this data reassuring. This is a relatively large study with 2,500 cycles. One of our NIH fellows presented exactly the same data almost at ASRM 2 years ago with 3,000 embryos and 700 cycles. He found a 39% aneuploidy rate. This had a 37% aneuploidy rate. He found a 1% difference between the two groups. This had a 2% difference between the two groups. So even though this is observational data with all this limitation, we're talking about almost 5,500 embryos between these two studies that don't show a difference, that really lean towards the null. And so to me, I find that reassuring. Now, anytime you have a null finding, you worry about your risk of type 2 error. And if you do a power analysis or sample size on this study, this study was powered to detect an 11% difference in aneuploidy on a per patient basis. And so we might argue that a smaller difference would be important. And so I think that's always good to point out when you have a null finding, that maybe we didn't have enough patients to find a smaller thing that we would find clinically significant. But I just want to point out that if we want to do an RCT on this study and we say 5% difference in aneuploidy is clinically significant, we would have to have 2,800 patients. And I don't know that anyone's going to invest in RCT 2,800 patients when we have this strong of observational data that suggests there probably isn't a difference in effect size between these two trigger mechanisms with aneuploidy.
Well said. Thank you, Micah. UConn or authors, do you have any comments on the comments from George or Micah?
I think it's well put, what Micah said, and I think it's very reassuring to hear that a similar study came up with similar results. So I agree. I think the data is pretty clear, showing the effectiveness of GnRH agonist trigger. So thank you for your comments.
Let's go back to Columbia. You must have more questions on the paper.
Yeah, we actually found that the aneuploidy rate seems on the higher side. So 37% of embryos were euploid. We focused on the euploidy rate. We were wondering if mosaicism, at least for the NGS portion, was that looked at, and was it different? Because you have basically like a few categories of results. You have euploid, you have potentially mosaic, you have aneuploid, and maybe no results. So they've demonstrated, I think, with statistical ability that the euploidy rates are similar, but we were wondering, because there have been some papers looking at differences in mosaicism rates, different labs or different culture media. So was that looked at? And any thoughts on the overall euploidy rate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in data collection, we did collect on rates of mosaicism. So we collected on mosaicism, euploidy, and aneuploidy. You come out with a very good point in that our euploidy rates seem a little low, and that was because at the time we were finding that using NGS, we were getting about 30% mosaicism rates. And that may be what was driving some of those euploidy rates a little lower than what's been previously reported. At the time that we were writing the study, there was sort of still an ongoing conversation about mosaicism and sort of how it factors into the equation. So for this study, we really chose just to focus on euploidy rates. We didn't examine mosaicism rates in depth. That would be a really good question going further. But for this paper, we focused on euploidy rates.
Excellent, thank you. Columbia, any other questions before we talk about some questions from the audience?
So I was wondering if you think these results apply to poor responders as well. I know you said to be included in the study, you had to have a blastocyst available for biopsy. So you're kind of excluding the patients who are just poor responders. The patients are obviously not the ones who are most risk for OHSS. But I didn't know if you think these results can kind of apply to them and whether or not using a lead run trigger for these more poor responder patients apply.
You see, you bring up a really good point. I think you were sort of asking about poor responders or those with no embryo development, and how did we account for those? So given the difference in cycle parameters between our groups, and we know that differences existed, there was a question that could there be a difference in developmental potential between these two groups as well, given that the GnRH agonist group is more of a high responder group, and the HCG trigger potentially a poor responder. One thing we did look at is blastulation rates between those, and those were equal, but still, to account for attrition bias, we analyzed our data per embryo biopsy and also by per oocyte retrieved, to try to account for this and provide some more reassuring data. We also included cycles that had no embryo development into a separate regression analysis. And when we did this, results were unchanged. I don't know if that made it into the manuscript, but it's definitely something that we had thought about as well and wanted to account for. So that's a great question.
Thank you very much. As you know, we're live in the audience watching us, and Emily Barnes, one of our interactive monitors from the audience and sending out the poll. What have we heard from the audience so far?
Thanks, Dr. Barnhart. And we've had really good engagement tonight from everyone who was tuned in, so thank you for that. As far as where our respondents are coming to us from, we had most individuals coming from North America tonight, but also some people from South America and Europe as well. The majority of people tuning in are REI providers, but we also had 15% embryology, as well as 10% researchers. Our first question that we asked was, do you use GnRH agonist triggers for PGTA cycles? And the response was about split in the middle, so 52% said yes and 47% said no. As far as concerns that our respondents had for using a GnRH agonist trigger, the largest proportion, 26%, said they were worried about failed endogenous release of the oocyte. And then shortly behind there were around 20% concerned about maturity of the oocyte, quality of the oocyte, as well as luteal support. And a lesser percentage, only 10%, saying they were worried about aneuploidy. With respect to our next question, we asked what percentage of cycles in the practices of people tuned in tonight use GnRH agonist triggers. And the majority were in the 1 to 25% category. So there were 14% that do not use GnRH agonist triggers at all. Nobody said they use them universally, but most people were kind of in the middle and on the lower end, I would say, of that. When looking at which patients our respondents use their GnRH agonist triggers for, only one person said they use them for all cycles. But 50% said that they use when they're concerned for OHSS. As we discussed, 23% said they'll use in if they're planning on a freeze-all cycle. And then for oocyte donors, again, 23% said they would use the GnRH agonist trigger. When asked which factors of the IVF cycle our respondents believe affect the aneuploidy rate, the highest percentage actually said none. So they didn't think that any of our poll questions affected aneuploidy rate. But following that, dose of gonadotropin, about 33% felt that affected the aneuploidy rate. About 20% said culture conditions affect the aneuploidy rate. And then only a few people thought stimulation protocol and day of oocyte retrieval were concerning to affect aneuploidy. And then for our last question, we haven't touched on this too much yet tonight, but what luteal support do our respondents use for a GnRH agonist trigger with an embryo transfer? So the majority said that they use intramuscular progesterone with estradiol. That was 50% of respondents. And that was followed by those who use vaginal progesterone and estradiol. That was 25%. So it looks like most people are using a progesterone in conjunction with estradiol, with less using progesterone by itself.
Thank you. So I think that the most intriguing question there was, what do we believe about an IVF cycle can affect aneuploidy? Eric, I want to direct this question to you because of your expertise. Is there anything we can do to a patient, and is there anything we can do in the lab that's going to affect the aneuploidy rate of their embryo?
I mean, that's a good question. I think by far age is, the dominant factor across many studies. Age always prevails, but beyond age, not many things have been conclusively shown to influence aneuploidy rate, other than maybe the platform or technology being used, as was alluded to earlier, with differing rates of mosaicism. So, I think that might reflect not something intrinsic to the embryo, but more how the biopsy DNA is processed and analyzed. But there have been studies looking at culture conditions, which were mentioned. Jason Swain has a nice review on different factors that might influence aneuploidy, and most of the studies really have not found significant differences, but there was, again, small studies suggesting maybe differences in mosaicism rates in single step versus sequential media, for example. But I think the thought that gonadotropin dose would affect aneuploidy, that hasn't really borne out in studies, at least retrospective studies. And really, again, I'm not certain that there's anything that we can do. I mean, there was an interesting small study recently that looked at severe male factor type cases, and they actually looked at, I think it was from Italy, they looked at the aneuploidy rate in cycles where the male partner gave 2 sperm samples for ICSI, and actually they found a lower aneuploidy rate when sperm was used from the second ejaculated sample. But it was a small study, and something like that I think needs to be replicated. But again, I think age is by far the biggest factor.
Excellent, thank you. Do you or your group have any more questions for our authors?
But I'd like to address a couple of the questions that were brought up regarding the lab conditions. I think most of us are familiar with the paper by Santi Munet. We look at donor cycles, the rate of aneuploidy, different clinics, different IVF labs, found significant differences between programs in aneuploidy using donor eggs, suggesting that perhaps the culture conditions in different labs may impact the rate of aneuploidy. So that's sort of an older study. I'm not sure it was using the most current technologies, but it's something to think about. So there may be things that we do in the lab that may be affecting the aneuploidy rates. So that's one comment. The other question that I wanted to comment was on the failure rate with the GnRH agonist trigger. That seems to be the #1 fear and the limiting factor why some clinics are reluctant to use it. And we published this several years ago, at least in our hands. The incidence of empty follicle syndrome was 1.4%, which is not that much different from you can get with the HCG trigger. And in our hands, we never had a problem if the post-trigger LH was over 15 MIUs per ml and the progesterone was over 3.5. So those are our cutoffs. And so I encourage everybody who's using this to check the next day to make sure that the trigger injection actually worked. There is a larger, I think, paper from Shady Grove, Chiang et al., and they had an incidence of 2%. And I think if we pay attention, we can sort of predict, what patients are at risk for having a suboptimal response to the agonist. There's a nice paper from Cornell, I think it's Meyer et al., published in Fertility and Sterility, and they were able to identify some risk factors, patients on long-term birth control pills, patients with a low LH level the day of the trigger, less than 0.5, were at risk for having a less than optimal response. And something that I've done sometimes if you are in doubt is just do a test, obviously in a previous cycle. And a patient, if you're concerned that may have some hypothalamic dysfunction, just give her a bolus of a dose of 1 milligram of leuprolide and check the next day to see if the LH went up. So if it does, you know when you are ready to use it that it's going to work.
Thank you. Leah, I think you had some comments as well.
Sure. So I really love the idea of discussing what are the other factors that might affect euploidy and aneuploidy, because it's very easy to say it's probably not much that we're doing that's affecting it or changing it. But I appreciate Dr. Hill's kind of incorporation of some of the physiology into the discussion as well. Like, what would the mechanism be for the different things that might potentially change euploidy rates? And one of the things that the center that I have started working at was looking at before I ever got here was the effects of euploidy on, or the effects of follicle size on euploidy and aneuploidy. And so they were in the midst of a study of where we're actually measuring every follicle before we aspirate the egg. And then we are grouping the eggs that come from different size groupings from the follicles directly. And what we're finding is that the higher rates of euploidy are coming from the larger follicles, whereas when we're getting eggs from all the smaller follicles too, but those tend to have more embryos with higher rates of aneuploidy. And so as some of it comes to the question of like timing of trigger, like how many days of stimulation and what size are we triggering our follicles at? In this paper, we trigger when the 3 lead follicles are 17 to 18 millimeters. But if you have a very high responder who is more likely to get an agonist trigger, it might be the case that the majority of our follicles are actually falling in the 14 to 16 millimeter range because we're triggering based on the lead. And so that's another thing to consider as a potential confounder is just because you have more and you're better prognosis doesn't always mean that the eggs coming out of all of your follicles are equally likely to be euploid. So it's another factor that we've started to think about and have started to talk about it at presentations at ARSRM, and hopefully you can get some more feedback from all of you on that topic as well.
That's a great point. I'm glad we're having this discussion because going back to the data on this paper, it would seem you could indirectly determine euploidy rate based on the number of follicles in the smaller group as well. That's the GnRH trigger group, and it didn't show a difference. But you're suggesting perhaps if we look more closely, it might be. I would really look forward to seeing that research. Let's go back to Columbia. I guess the equal question is, are you satisfied with the study, and are they well reported, and do you think that this question is answered?
So, I mean, I congratulate the authors. I think it was a great and full attempt. Retrospective, of course, with all of its limitations, but a large number of patients and well done given the circumstances. But I think it needs to be further validated in a prospective study and then ideally randomized control trial, but a great first step.
Any other comments? Because I'm going to start going around the room to kind of summarize your thoughts. So at the Columbia group, why don't you go from the table and give me your thoughts on this topic?
I thought it was a great study, and thank you very much. There are a lot of questions raised by the study regarding the laboratory, which I think has to be further investigated, as well as the ongoing pregnancy rates and live-born rates. I would be interested in seeing those as well.
So I think the point that was raised by a number of panelists and authors that was raised in the discussion, which is a good one, which is obviously the inherent limitations of retrospective study. But my question, and I could even pose this to the authors of the paper, the point that Jeff raised at the very beginning about the emphasis on safety, and it's not subtle, the reduction in the risk of OHSS with the use of leuprine trigger. That's really dramatic. And on the other hand, we're discussing whether they may be effective on aneuploidy rates, and if those are there, they seem at best to be quite small. So my question is, while it's true that a randomized prospective study would be the gold standard to answer this question, to bring up Mika's point of the thousands of patients that would be needed and the investment of time and resources, do you think that the question of aneuploidy, depending on trigger, is worthwhile pursuing with randomized controlled trial, or would you say if there is a difference, it's going to be a small one, and at the benefit of having such a dramatic reduction in the risk of OHSF, but it wouldn't really be the best use of time and energy to do an RCT to answer this question?
I think that's a great point that you raise. You know, we've talked a lot about the limitations of a retrospective study, but there are advantages as well, and that it's feasible, and you know, RCT is expensive. It takes a lot of time and money and resources to run. I think given the data that we've discussed tonight, both with this study, some of the data that Micah added in, I would feel quite comfortable with the results of the study, and I don't know if it's necessarily worth our time, money, or energy or resources to pursue it further, but an RCT is always the gold standard. Any others?
Why don't we go to Micah and George? Have any final comments on this discussion? Micah?
Sure. You know, on the RCT comment, of course, that's the gold standard. That's what we would always love to have. But when you have pretty strong biologic plausibility and you have consistent observational data from observational studies, you don't necessarily need an RCT. And some of the best examples are smoking and lung cancer. We don't have an RCT showing that increases it, but the biologic plausibility is there. The observational data is overwhelming. This doesn't meet quite that standard, but I think it's still pretty strong. If I was going to invest money in an RCT, this wouldn't be the place that I would go. I would feel fairly comfortable that I'm probably not causing a difference in embryo quality, egg quality, and euploidy by doing a GnRH agonist trigger.
George, you want to summarize some thoughts on the paper before we close out?
Yeah, I will agree with what everybody said. I think that this paper shows that there's no real difference between the aneuploidy rates, whether you're using a GnRH trigger or a HCG trigger, and given that safety is obviously the primary concern and is certainly more of a focus as we've seen with the push towards single embryo transfer. I don't think there's a point to do an RCT for this, given that it will take a large number of patients, a large number of resources. Those can probably be allocated to other questions that may be even better answered by the RCT.
I'd like to go back to UConn. John, pleasure to have you here, and congratulations on your study. I haven't heard you give some opinions on this paper and this conference. Do you care to share your thoughts?
Any final comments? Can you repeat the question? Because we couldn't hear it.
Sure. I was just going back to your group. Hadn't heard much from the rest of your team. John was offering directly. I'd like to make a comment on your paper.
Well, firstly, Kurt, what I'd like to do is just acknowledge Lawrence Engman, who's the senior author on the paper. I mean, he has really, with Claudia Benediva and our fellows, has really spearheaded this research effort. He would love to be here, but he's currently right now on a flight back to Ghana to give a postgraduate course in his home country. But I think, our fellows and Dr. Engman have done a huge amount of work with this, and I think they are really to be congratulated with the work that they have done with this. But I think this study just adds to, our extensive experience with using a GnRH agonist trigger and demonstrates the efficacy of this modality. And I think it's something, from your data or from your questions, it appears that, it's a relatively small percentage of folks who are using this modality. And I think one can strongly argue, and that someone who's doing a freeze-only cycle, utilization of a GnRH agonist really should be, the standard of care, because you can totally eliminate, the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And we've demonstrated that you can have equal efficacy when you do a subsequent transfer. And now we've demonstrated that euploidy rates are in essence the same. So I think people should give pause to this and should give, serious consideration to using uniformly a GnRH agonist trigger when you're going to do a freeze-only cycle.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to our host, Columbia, and I'll ask Eric if he has some final thoughts, or anyone else in the room, before we conclude the lovely discussion.
Yeah, I mean, one point that I thought was interesting is it was alluded to earlier that they excluded so-called dual or combined triggers, but I think like stimulation in this field, a lot of us use mixed protocols, and actually there's not great data, supporting that. We just have come to that clinical practice. All the randomized trials compare FSH versus HMG, here, and a lot of RCTs that haven't done looking at the glucagon trigger or GnRH agonist trigger have been HCG versus GnRH agonist trigger, and maybe because of some, nervousness or learning curve, I think in clinical practice, the dual trigger is being used a lot more often than we might realize. So I'd be curious, if they could tell us how many cases were excluded. I mean, could they have included that as a third line, or too small? And in clinical practice, again, I think using less HCG lowers the risk, even though, like Dr. Bennett even said, there is still some risk. It may be a way that people ease into being comfortable with the agonist trigger.
Thank you, Eric. Good comments. I want to give the authors the final word. I haven't heard too much from Leah lately. Leah, congratulations on a lovely paper. Do you have some final comments or thoughts?
I'll just say thank you all for reading, and many, many kudos to Jeff Thorne, who tackled all the statistics on this paper. I'm thoroughly impressed, and much of those kudos then should go to UConn and the training that we got in fellowship. So that's it. Thanks for reading.
Jeff, since you were alluded to finally, I'll give you the final word. You're the first author on this lovely paper. I appreciate the paper in the journal, and I appreciate the comments. So what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody being here tonight. I think there's been some really wonderful discussion, and I'm really just happy that this study can sort of contribute to the literature and can contribute to our practice. Really, I think I'm going to just sort of summarize what everybody has said, but our hope is that just this eases physician anxiety in using a GnRH agonist for trigger, especially in their freeze-all cycles. I think we've made a compelling argument that it has equal efficacy to HCG and can really decrease OHSS, patient discomfort. So I think there's no negative, hopefully we found that there's no negative impact between the two trigger modalities. And we just hope we can ease patient anxiety in using this medication. If they have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for participating in this journal club. I usually end with a question, is it going to change your practice? And I'm always dismayed that we have an hour discussion and no one changes their practice. But in this case, the message is you shouldn't change your practice. GnRH antagonist trigger seems to be safe and effective. I appreciate the evidence base behind that decision. So again, it was a pleasure discussing this article on fertility club. So I will say good night or good morning or good afternoon to wherever you are in the world watching this journal club. I appreciate this ongoing ability to discuss important topics with the authors directly. And remember, this will be live. This will be available to you to log on later to watch. And I hope I'll see you all at the next Journal Club at ASRM. Thank you all again. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.